That is the sound of the modern world being born. It's the sound of empires crumbling, a generation being lost, and a map being redrawn in blood and mud. It's the sound that precedes a single gunshot on a sunny street corner in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, one man's death would set the stage for the slaughter of 20 million more. But this wasn't some masterfully executed plan. It's a story of pure chance, of breathtaking incompetence, and a fateful wrong turn that put a 19-year-old assassin face to face with his destiny. This is the story of how one bullet, fired from a simple pistol, became the single most destructive projectile in human history, plunging an entire world into war. The day was June 28, 1914. It was a beautiful, sun-drenched summer morning in Sarajevo, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian province of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The air was festive, the streets lined with curious and cheering crowds. They were there to see him, the heir to the sprawling, ancient and increasingly fragile Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand wasn't a universally loved figure. Within the empire, his political ideas were seen as dangerously progressive by some, and his marriage to Countess Sophie Chotek, a woman considered below his station, was a constant palace scandal. For nationalists in the Balkans, however, he was something else entirely, the symbol of an oppressive foreign power. His visit to Sarajevo, scheduled with an almost provocative disregard for local feeling on St. Vitus Day, a day of huge significance for Serbian nationalism, was seen as an arrogant display of Habsburg power. Lurking among the crowds that day were at least 6 assassins, young men armed with bombs and pistols. They were members of a revolutionary movement called Young Bosnia, but they were supplied and guided by a shadowy Serbian secret society with a terrifying name, the Black Hand. Led by Colonel Dragutin Dmitrijević, the chief of Serbian military intelligence, the Black Hand's goal was simple and absolute: the creation of a greater Serbia, uniting all Serb peoples by any means necessary, including terrorism. The royal couple's motorcade began its procession along the Apel Quay, a wide boulevard running next to the Miljacka River. The security was shockingly lax. The Archduke's schedule and exact route had been published in the newspapers. It was a perfect opportunity for the conspirators. As the 6-car procession approached the Kumurja Bridge, the first assassin, Nedeljko Kabrinović, made his move. He armed his bomb by striking it against a lamppost and hurled it at the Archduke's open-topped car. Here, fate intervened for the first time. The driver saw the dark object flying through the air and instinctively hit the gas. The bomb bounced off the folded-back convertible roof, rolled under the car behind, and detonated. The explosion wounded 2 officers in the following car and several spectators, but the Archduke and his wife were unharmed. Chaos erupted. Kabrinović swallowed a cyanide pill which, didn't work, and then he jumped into the shallow river where he was quickly captured. The other assassins, including our 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, lost their nerve in the pandemonium and, well, didn't act. The motorcade, now moving at high speed, raced to the town hall. The assassination attempt had been a public, spectacular failure. Upon arrival at the town hall, a furious Franz Ferdinand confronted the mayor. His planned speech was still in his pocket, spattered with the blood of the men wounded in the attack. After a tense exchange, he regained his composure. Against the advice of his security detail, the Archduke made a fateful decision. He insisted on abandoning the day's schedule to visit the wounded officers in the hospital. To avoid the city center, the drivers were explicitly told to change the route and proceed straight along the Apel Quay. But in the confusion, nobody told the Archduke's driver. As the motorcade departed, the driver followed the car in front, making the same wrong turn onto Franz Josef Street. General Oskar Potiorek, the governor of Bosnia, who was in the car with the royal couple, realized the mistake immediately. "What is this? This is the wrong way. We're supposed to go along the Apel Quay." The driver slammed on the brakes. The large Graf and stiff touring car stalled as he tried to reverse. And well, it stalled in the worst possible place on earth. It stopped directly in front of Schiller's Delicatessen. Standing on the curb, having given up all hope for the day, was 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip. For a moment, history held its breath. The conspirator, who had failed to act just minutes before, now found his target delivered to him, stationary, less than 5 feet away. He didn't hesitate. Princip stepped forward, raised his FN Model 1910 pistol, and fired 2 shots. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second hit the Archduke in the neck, severing his jugular vein. At first, no one seemed to realize how serious it was. Podiorik thought they were unhurt, but as he looked closer, he saw blood. Sophie collapsed onto her husband's lap. Franz Ferdinand, still conscious, cradled his dying wife, pleading, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die! Live for our children!" An aide asked if he was in pain. The Archduke, his voice fading, whispered, "It is nothing," over and over. By the time they reached the governor's residence minutes later, both Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his beloved wife were dead. The spark had been lit. Now the world would watch as the powder keg exploded. So, how could a single act of violence in a provincial city ignite a global catastrophe? To understand that, we need to zoom out from the streets of Sarajevo and look at Europe in 1914. The assassination didn't cause the war on its own. It was just the match thrown into a barrel brimming with gunpowder. Europe was a powder keg, primed by a toxic mix of 4 forces, often remembered by the acronym MAIN: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Let's start with militarism. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a massive arms race across Europe. The Industrial Revolution had turned weapon production into a huge state-sponsored enterprise. War wasn't just a tool of policy anymore. It was glorified, seen as a noble test of a nation's strength. This was obvious in the naval race between Great Britain and Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II declared that Germany needed a place in the sun, and a world-class navy was key. This kicked off a frantic shipbuilding competition. On land, things were just as tense. Germany and France, bitter rivals since the Franco-Prussian War, had huge standing armies. Military leaders developed complex, aggressive war plans, not as defensive options, but as timetables for a quick victory. The most infamous of these was Germany's Schlieffen Plan. It was Germany's answer to a dreaded 2-front war against both France and Russia. The plan assumed Russia would take at least 6 weeks to mobilize. In that window, Germany would throw most of its forces into a lightning-fast invasion through neutral Belgium to crush France. Then, it would use its modern railways to race those troops to the Eastern Front to face Russia. The Schlieffen Plan was a logistical masterpiece, but it was incredibly rigid. It was an all-or-nothing gamble that turned the act of mobilization into an act of war, leaving no room for diplomacy once the first troops moved. This brings us to the second force, a tangled web of alliances. In the decades before 1914, Europe's great powers had split into 2 armed camps. These defense treaties were supposed to keep the peace, but in reality, they created a continental hair-trigger. On one side you had the Triple Alliance Germany and Austria-Hungary, bound by culture, and later joined by Italy. Opposing them was the Triple Entente, a less formal but just as strong understanding between France, Russia, and Great Britain, all united by a common fear of Germany. This system created a fatal domino effect. A fight between Austria-Hungary and Serbia could now directly involve Germany and Russia. A conflict between Germany and Russia would drag in France. And Germany's plan to attack France through Belgium would almost certainly bring in the British Empire, a guarantor of Belgian neutrality. The third ingredient was imperialism. The great powers were in a fierce global race for colonies, resources, and prestige. Britain and France had vast empires, but Germany, a newer nation, felt cheated. This drive for global power, or Weltpolitik, often put it in conflict with Britain and France, adding another layer of suspicion to European politics. Finally, and maybe most powerfully, there was nationalism. It was the driving emotion of the era, a force that could build nations and tear empires apart. In countries like Britain, France, and Germany, it was an aggressive, flag-waving patriotism. Many young people were eager for a war they thought would be short, heroic, and over by Christmas. But another, more volatile nationalism was brewing in the Balkans, the so-called powder keg of Europe. As the Ottoman Empire weakened, new nations like Serbia emerged. Serbia saw itself as the champion of the South Slavs, with a mission to liberate Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes still under Austro-Hungarian rule in places like Bosnia. This put Serbia on a direct collision course with Vienna, which saw this Slavic nationalism as a mortal threat to its existence. This is where it all connects. The assassins were fervent Serbian nationalists. Gavrilo Princip himself said at his trial, "I am a Yugoslav nationalist, aiming for the unification of all Yugoslavs. It must be free from Austria." He didn't just kill a man, he killed the symbol of the empire blocking his national dream. His bullet was propelled by the explosive force of nationalism. The deaths of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie on June 28 didn't start the war immediately. For weeks, a deceptive calm settled over Europe. But behind the scenes, a frantic slide into catastrophe was underway, known as the July Crisis. It all started with Austria-Hungary. For hardliners in Vienna, the assassination was the perfect excuse to crush Serbia once and for all. But they couldn't risk fighting Serbia if it meant also fighting Serbia's powerful protector Russia. So, Vienna needed to know where its main ally, Germany, stood. On July 5th, an Austrian envoy met with Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kaiser, outraged by the murder, gave Austria what's now called the blank check, an unconditional promise that Germany would back Austria-Hungary, even if it led to war with Russia. This was the most critical decision of the entire crisis. It emboldened Austria and handed control of the situation to the war-hungry generals in Vienna. With Germany's backing, the Austrians spent 2 weeks drafting an ultimatum for Serbia. It was designed to be so harsh that no sovereign nation could accept it. Delivered on July 23 with a 48-hour deadline, it demanded Serbia suppress all anti-Austrian groups. But the killer demand was point 6. Serbia had to let Austro-Hungarian officials participate in the investigation on Serbian soil. This was a direct violation of Serbian sovereignty, and Vienna knew it. Serbia panicked and appealed to Russia. Meanwhile, the Serbs crafted a masterful reply. Just before the deadline, they delivered their response, accepting almost all the terms. They only rejected the single point about Austrian officials on their land, suggesting it be referred to the International Court. It was an incredibly conciliatory reply, but Austria wasn't interested in talking, it was interested in war. Using the rejection of that one clause as a pretext, Austria-Hungary broke off diplomatic relations and, on July 28, 1914, declared war on Serbia. Now the fatal logic of the alliances took over. The second domino was Russia. Seeing its small Slavic ally attacked, Russia couldn't just stand by. On July 30th, Tsar Nicholas II ordered a full mobilization of the massive Russian army. This act pushed the crisis past the point of no return. Germany saw Russia's mobilization as a direct threat. Their entire strategy, the Schlieffen Plan, depended on striking first. A frantic last-ditch effort took place via telegrams between the German Kaiser and the Russian Tsar, two cousins who called each other Willy and Nicky. But their personal messages were useless against the pressure from their generals. On July 31st, Germany issued an ultimatum to Russia: demobilize within 12 hours. Russia refused. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. The third domino toppled. The Schlieffen Plan was now active. On August 2nd, German troops invaded Luxembourg. Germany then demanded its armies be allowed to pass through Belgium to attack France. Belgium, a neutral country, bravely refused. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. The fourth domino was down. The final crucial domino was Great Britain. The British cabinet was divided, but two things forced its hand. First, the strategic fear of a German-dominated Europe. Britain couldn't let France be crushed. Second, and more immediately, was Belgium. Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium was a direct violation of the Treaty of London, a treaty Britain felt honor-bound to uphold. When news of the invasion reached London on August 4th, the debate was over. Britain issued its own ultimatum to Germany: withdraw from Belgium. Germany ignored it. At 11 p.m. London time on August 4, 1914, Great Britain declared war on Germany. The last domino had fallen. In just over 1 month, a single assassination had set off a catastrophic chain reaction. A Balkan dispute had become a European war, and with the entry of the vast British Empire, it would become a world war. The lights, as British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey famously remarked, were going out all over Europe. They wouldn't be lit again for 4 long, devastating years. This intricate web of causes and the tragic countdown of the July crisis show just how fragile peace can be. If you found this journey into the past compelling, and want to understand more about the pivotal moments that have shaped our world, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another exploration of history. The story of how the First World War began is a story of a single bullet and a continent-sized powder keg. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the spark, a violent personal event that gave the immediate reason for war. But the conflict wasn't inevitable just because of what Gavrilo Princip did. War was made possible by decades of tension that came before him. It was made possible by a culture of militarism that glorified violence and created inflexible war plans that left no room for diplomacy. It was made possible by a rigid system of alliances that turned a regional crisis into a continental catastrophe. It was made possible by the bitter rivalries of imperialism that poisoned relations between the great powers. And it was made possible by the fervent, uncompromising force of nationalism, which fueled both the assassins' motives and the public's thirst for war. Over the next 4 years, the war that everyone thought would be over by Christmas would consume the globe. It would lead to the deaths of millions of soldiers and civilians. It would shatter 4 great empires, the Austro-Hungarian, German, Ottoman, and Russian, and redraw the map of Europe and the Middle East. It would introduce the world to the horrors of trench warfare, poison gas, and industrial-scale slaughter. And its flawed conclusion would sow the seeds for an even more devastating conflict just 2 decades later. The shot fired on that Sarajevo street corner on June 28, 1914, wasn't just the end of one man's life. It was the end of an era. It was the violent birth of the 20th century, a stark, brutal lesson in how pride, fear, and a web of fatal connections can lead humanity down the path to self-destruction.